Okay, so I am going through like the vast majority of chapter 5. I'm going to. Oh, that's the end of the school day. We're done for the day. No, seriously though, I am going to go through most of chapter 5 in about 3 videos. There's stuff that goes on in this that I talked about last video that I put up for you guys, where I was talking about this idea of like external and internal forces kind of acting on Japan. And if you guys go back to the very beginning when we were talking about why Japan chose to isolate, a big push was this desire to maintain power. And so you can imagine how external forces acting upon Japan would create some amount of stress or strife or even anger or resentment from the shogun. So here we go. We're going to jump right into this. There were a lot of outside forces actually acting on Japan, and you guys may or may not be able to identify that. You might have cousins or family or friends that are telling you that, oh, you should come to my school because this is happening here and we get to do this. And they have like, I know as a teacher at the Christian school, I hear kids always saying, oh, I'm going to this school because they have bonkers options. They got so many options, and or my friend that I am on a sports team with is there, and he says that I'll have such a good time if I go there. And I'm not saying that that is or isn't true. I'm just saying that there are, even in your lives, outside forces that are acting upon you, and you have a choice, or maybe you don't. Like, if you were one of my kids, you would not have a choice. I am the one that is the one in control, and I make the decisions. Now, I haven't had any of my children come to me and say, Dad, you're being unfair with the way that you're managing my affairs. But I do stand by and say that I am kind of like the shogun, or the bakufu, the military government. I am the one that gets to make that decision, and my word is law. So, this one here is quite natural. The first influence, Russia is a very powerful, very large nation, and they have something called the Kamchatka Peninsula. And if you think about Alaska on the northern part of Canada up there, and then there's a small piece that goes out, and then down from that, there's a little tailing bunch of islands that come down into the Pacific Ocean. The Russians gave the Chinese or the Japanese a lot of grief during the re-emergence from their isolation. So Japan was pressured by Russia to rejoin the rest of the world. And like, there is a really nice little series of like a timeline here that tells you how that went. But the Russians very early on were the first ones kind of putting that pressure on Japan to come out of isolation, rejoin the world. And one of the big things here, if you look at this word here, the Ainu, that is the first time we've seen that word, and it's going to be new to you guys. But that's kind of like their First Nations people. And they live in islands along that same Kamchatka Peninsula, and the Russians began talking to them and converting them, and that caused the Japanese a lot of stress. And hilariously enough, kind of like the treating of our First Nations here in Canada, the Ainu were not treated very nicely by the Japanese. So Japan defends itself and eventually pushes the Russians out. Actually, the Russians weren't really pushed out. That's inaccurate. The Russians had a war on another front, and so their attention was drawn away. So Japan actually, instead of actually, defending itself and pushing Russia out, Japan got lucky because Russia got distracted. And when Russia's back was turned, and Japan kind of like scurried away and pretended nothing had happened. And that's going to be kind of a common thread here. So here's a little description of who the Ainu are. This is that Kamchatka Peninsula I was talking about, and these are the Kuril Islands that are the disputed zone that we were talking about. So one other thing, in that trading port in Deshima, there is that's where the Dutch East Indian Trading Company used to bring boats, and they would dock there and unload their goods. One of the things that was bought by a lot of high-level Japanese officials was books about the outside world, about how ships were made, about the various different advancements. Japan is actually isolated during the Industrial Revolution, and so they're buying books from this outside world, and they have these like massive misconceptions about what the outside world is like. They used to think if you listen to the videos from Mr. Chabot, they thought that the outside world was one massive world government, and that there was like not actually different countries. They didn't understand the outside world very well. So the whole Dutch East Indian Trading Company thing, they brought in a whole bunch of ideas from the outside world that Japan was just kind of confused about, and at times trying to learn about. But because they didn't have because they weren't fully immersed in the outside world, they just didn't fully understand it. They were getting just small glimpses of stuff without full understanding. Now, this one right here, this next section that comes up, there's more pressure, Japan, instead of actually going and exploring it and trying to figure out, they basically put on the bravest face they can, and like a dog that is backed into a corner, they raise the hair on the back of their neck, and they basically tell the outside world, if you come into our country, we're going to defend ourselves without any that's it. Don't think twice. They aren't going to spend time saying, do I or don't I? It is going to happen without any extra thought. China. So this is where everything kind of goes sideways for Japan. Japan thought they were relatively strong, and they thought China was really strong. They knew that China was significantly stronger than they were, and so they always looked up to China. Now, what happens during this time period is Britain rolls in and basically has a small skirmish with China, and they absolutely destroy China, like not even close. They just beat the snot out of China, and when they do, they tell China that they're going to sign an unfair treaty with them, which, of course, it's extra fair for Britain, less fair for China. And the Chinese officials have no choice but to sign it, because basically Britain is acting kind of like a bully. And that bullying thing is going to be a common thread for the next little bit we'll talk about again. China, though, was viewed by the Japanese as being very strong. And when the Japanese watched China get just smacked around, the Japanese all of a sudden realized just how tiny and how weak they are. And again, they don't respond well to it. Instead of going and, giving Britain a call and saying, hey, Britain, we really want to find a good way to come out. Can you help us with us coming out of isolation so that it'll be good for us? They just continue to bury their head further in the sand and pretend like the outside world isn't there. And that gets us to this next bit. So the Dutch, which is the Netherlands, they know more about Japan because they've been trading with them for longer. He sends a letter, but his letter arrives too late. The Japanese, this all happens just that little bit too late. Oh, the Dutch East Indian Trading Company. This is an introduction of a word called monopoly, which you guys have played the game, but you probably don't understand. A monopoly is basically I am able to bully the board game, or I'm able to make sure that no one else can have the same level of access to the industry, whatever it might be. So, for example, Microsoft got charged with creating a monopoly because they had made it so that so that browsers like Chrome couldn't run as well. You can see my Chrome tab down here. So that Chrome couldn't run as well on a Microsoft computer. So they were charged with creating a monopoly. And basically, the Dutch East Indian Trading Company had a complete monopoly of trade in Asia. So, anyways, it was actually when it at its height, it was bigger than Amazon and Apple and Microsoft and like all the biggest companies out there you can think of. It was bigger than all of those combined. It was absolutely huge, the buying power and the influence it had. So here we go. This is where Japan is finally kind of, it doesn't come out gently, it just is forced out. America is engaged, and if you listen to the story about Manjiro, you would have heard about Manjiro joining the whaling ships. Well, in that same story, America is doing whale hunts in the area around Japan, and they would like to be able to have access to the ports. Now, America looks at the situation where they say this is a perfectly viable country. They should be able to allow us, if our ship is in trouble or something like that, they should be able to allow us to come to their ports and get stuff. But Japan, again, is head in the sand, super afraid. Commodore Matthew Perry comes in, and he is given the task of forcing Japan into the world by his government. He comes to Japan and he says, hey, you're going to open up one way or the other, and whether you like it or not, I'm going to get access to your ports. He went away and he told the Japanese that if they didn't open the ports, then he would force them open. He left and he returned, I think, with twice as many ships. And when he came back, the Japanese were overwhelmed by these massive ships that looked like floating cities, and these strangers who had so much, truthfully, if the U.S. wanted to, the U.S. could have literally bombed all these cities, or not bombed, shot cannonballs at all these cities, and the Japanese would have had no answer to it, and it would have gone very badly. So the Japanese signed what's called an unequal treaty. And that is a bit of foreshadowing for later on when we talk about internal stresses. The Bakufu signed the Treaty of Kanazawa, and this, the Japanese, I'm going to read this. The Japanese felt that they achieved a major goal because they'd entered into an agreement that allowed them to maintain independent authority and control over the country. This isn't an equal treaty when everything is all said and done. So the Harris Treaty comes on, and the Americans, again, being the superpower that they were even at that time, these treaties give America a lot of power, and they were unequal. I'm just going to leave it at that. And that creates a lot of the stress that we're going to see when we come into those internal stresses. So because the Bakufu is seen as being weak, the people of Japan thought that the Bakufu and the samurai that were there were like these warlords and were in power and in control, and they would be guiding the Japanese through to the best results. But they found out the hard way that they maybe weren't as intelligent or as well thought out as they had hoped. So Japan was pressured into signing treaties with Russia, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. These treaties were also considered unequal, and the Japanese felt that the shogun was no longer in control and had been humiliated. And remember, these are very proud people. He was no longer the subduer of barbarians. And there is massive unrest inside of Japan. I'm just going to go down one more thing here. That's the Dutch East Indian Trading Company. There's Matthew Perry right there. He's the one that actually forced Japan out of isolation. And I will put up a video this week that has some stuff about him in there for you guys. So this is that picture, these American forces and these samurai. And imagine that, all these throngs of people behind there watching as the Bakufu, the shogun, actually goes and signs an agreement. And truth be told, if these guys wanted to at any point in time, with their muskets and their guns, and their everything else they had, and their cannons and their fleets of ships, they could have just wrecked the Japanese. So Japan is, Japan's unable to actually defend itself against the will of someone else. So I'm going to put a pause that there, and when the next video comes up, it will be on this internal stress and strife for Japan. So I'll see you guys in a few seconds.